This video will go over 10 cards with effects so broken, Konami had to either change the effect of the card itself to make it playable, or the card still resides on the ban list today. At number 10 we have Firewall Dragon, a card that was actually playable in the game until very recently. Firewall Dragon is a Link 4 monster that has the effect where you can add cards to the hand from the graveyard or field equal to the amount of Link monsters Firewall Dragon is co-linked to. And since the effect is quick effect, you can use it during your opponent's turn to disrupt plays. And he can also be used to refill your hands with cards in the graveyard. Now here comes in the broken effect. His second effect is, if a card it's pointing to is sent to the graveyard, you can special summon one monster from your hand. And this effect is not once per turn. So, if you had a way to both send a card to the graveyard and add a card back to your hand, you could infinitely summon and send a card to the graveyard with Cannon Soldier to FTK your opponent. And people kept finding ways to accomplish this goal. Konami tried its best to ban cards which could abuse the second effect to infinitely recycle cards with Cannon Soldier, until eventually they decided they had to ban the problem card itself. So Firewall Dragon was put on the ban list for this effect just being too abusable. And after you see the rest of the cards on this list, it's kind of amazing to think that Konami is still printing broken cards to this day. You'd think they would have learned their lesson after the first 10 or so times. At number 9 we have Dark Strike Fighter. Now this is one of the cards who had an effect that was broken enough where Konami just straight up changed the card text. Its old effect was you could tribute one monster to inflict damage to your opponent equal to that monster's level times 200. And this effect was not once per turn, and could be used on itself. And since Dark Strike Fighter himself is a generic level 7 synchro monster, it's real easy to bring out. So it was like a Cannon Soldier on steroids. And Cannon Soldier itself is honestly a card that will probably be on the ban list someday, as Cannon Soldier's already banned over in the OCG for its FTK potential. Basically, what old school Dark Strike Fighter decks would do is attack with their monsters like normal, synchro into a Dark Strike Fighter during the main phase 2, and then tribute all of their monsters for burn damage to finish them off. Since Dark Strike Fighter himself was worth 1400 points of burn damage if he used his effect on himself. And there were tons of OTKs and FTKs enabled by this effect. That's why the card got banned like almost immediately, and it stayed on the ban list until it was errated. And its new effect tries very hard to disallow all of its old degenerate strategies. Its new effect can only be used during your main phase 1, so you can no longer tribute all of your monsters in your main phase 2 to do a little bit more burn damage to just finish off your opponent. And the effect can only be used once per turn, so he can't be used to just tribute everything you control. You know a card was broken when they overfixed the card like they did with Dark Strike Fighter. Number 8, Sinister Serpent. This card also got an errata to change its old school effect. Its old effect was, if it was in your graveyard, during your standby phase, you could add it to your hand. So if you had 3 copies of Sinister Serpent in your graveyard, you could just add all 3 back to your hand during every standby phase. And with this, it was just instant card advantage every turn that could be used for any kind of discard effect. And because easy card advantage every turn for no cost was too powerful, it got an errata. And its new effect is, it still adds itself back to your hand during the standby phase, but if it exists in your graveyard during your opponent's next end phase, you have to banish one Sinister Serpent from your graveyard, and you can only use the effect once per turn, so you can no longer add all 3 back. So with the new effect, you can still add it back to your hand one time, but if you then discard it again, you won't be able to add it back since it will just be banished before your next standby phase. So if you want to keep gaining advantage from Sinister Serpent, you can only discard it every other turn to avoid its banish effect, and you can't use more than one. And with his new effect, no one really uses it because it's kinda slow, but it's also no longer completely broken like it used to be. Number 7, Painful Choice. This card has the effect where you can select any 5 cards from your deck and show them to your opponent. Then your opponent will select one of those cards and add it to your hand, and then you discard the other 4 cards to the graveyard. This is like a Foolish Burial on steroids, and Foolish Burial is a limited card for being so good. Even Armageddon Knight, who can only send a dark monster from your deck to the graveyard, recently got put on the limited list for being such a good card. So a card that allows you to selectively mill 5 cards from your deck is just incredibly powerful, unlike a broken level. And to add to that, you even get to add one of those cards to your hand. The card isn't even a -1 like Foolish Burial. It's just pure advantage and allows you to set up your graveyard with whatever you want. There is no way this card could ever come back to the game, and I honestly can't think how they would errata it to fix the problem. Unless the card had some kind of steep cost to its activation, kind of like paying half your life points, and then you only got to excavate the top 5 cards of your deck, and your opponent got to choose one of those instead. Number 6, Card of Safe Return. This card has the effect where if a monster is special summoned from the graveyard, you can draw 1 card, and this effect is not once per turn. One of the main drawbacks to decks that special summon from the graveyard a lot is that you have to lose advantage to do it, and this card would completely eliminate that very justifiable drawback and turn basically all of those decks into crazy broken special summon spam fests. It even could be used in a couple of meta decks today and just make them much more consistent than they already are. Basically, any kind of card which doesn't have a once per turn on an easy activation requirement for drawing a card is going to be broken. And the best way to fix this card would probably just to give it a once per turn clause. Funny enough, its anime effect allowed you to draw 3 cards when a monster was special summoned from the graveyard. That's why the card artwork has 3 cards above the guy, which would be insane considering it's already broken when you can only draw 1 card. Number 5, Last Turn. This card has the effect where it can only be activated during your opponent's turn when your life points are 1,000 or less. Then you select 1 monster on your side of the field, send all cards in the field in both players' hands to the graveyard, then your opponent gets to special summon any monster from their deck in face-up attack position. Then your monster and your opponent's new monster battle, and whoever survives the battle and lasts until the end phase of that turn wins the duel. And any other results cause a tie. Now, if you simply select a monster on your side of the field which restricts your opponent from special summoning a monster, then you basically automatically win, since they can't special summon a monster from their deck, and you'll be the only one with a monster on your side of the field at the end phase. Now, despite the fact that this card allows you to win the duel pretty easily if you build a deck around it, if your opponent does manage to mess with your strategy, it could easily result in a draw. And Konami does not like draws. This card is kind of a nightmare when it comes to rulings, as there are so many ways to just mess with it, that the card itself is just too inherently broken to be fixed. So I'll be surprised if the card ever comes back in any way, shape, or form. Number 4, Delinquent Duo. With this card, you pay 1,000 life points to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand. If used on your first turn, your opponent will basically start the duel with 4 cards in their opening hand. Now, there are other cards in the game which can allow you to discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand, but all of them require much more effort than just paying 1,000 life points and having 1 card. And disruption of this level is just incredibly powerful and too broken for how easy it is to pull off. There are even other cards in the ban list that only discard 1 card from your opponent's hand, and those cards are also really strong, and Delinquent Duo snipes 2 of them. When this card was live, pretty much everyone ran it in every single deck they possibly could, and you were almost guaranteed to lose if you went second, and your opponent opened up with a Delinquent Duo. Number 3, Spellbook of Judgment. Now, Dragon Rulers are usually held as one of the strongest archetypes ever made, seeing as all the mainstay cards are banned. And yet, Dragon Rulers weren't even a tier 0 deck when they first came out. And the reason Dragon Rulers didn't completely dominate their first format was because Spellbook of Judgment also existed at the same time. Spellbook of Judgment's effect was, after the card was activated, you could count all the spell cards activated that turn, and then during the end phase, add Spellbook spell cards from your deck to your hand, equal to the number of spell cards you activated after Spellbook of Judgment that turn. Then, you can special summon 1 spellcaster type monster from your deck, who had a level less than or equal to the number of Spellbook cards you added to your hand with the effect. And the Spellbook spell cards were pretty good. So with Judgment, you can activate as many of your Spellbook cards a turn as possible, and then completely refill your hand during the end phase, and bring out a monster on top of it. Spellbook of Judgment could easily allow you to go +5 or +7 at the end of your turn. And it was effortless too, because the deck itself had multiple ways to search out Spellbook of Judgment. The amount of pure advantage as one card generated was just insane for the time period this card came out in. We had thought Konami was done with printing completely broken cards, as a lot of the really degenerate cards were printed in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! So something like Spellbook of Judgment coming out and allowing you to go +7 at the end of your turn was kinda surprising for it being a modern card. And everyone knew it was a matter of time before the card got banned, and that's why spellbooks were a very good meta deck in their time, even with full power dragon rulers running around. And even after Spellbook of Judgment got banned, spellbooks were still a good deck for like a few years, which goes to show how crazy spellbooks were when they had a card like Judgment alive as well. Number 2, Makyura the Destructor. This card has the effect where if it's sent to the graveyard, you can now activate trap cards from your hand for the turn. The card Temple of the Kings had a similar effect before it got eroded, so I'll include that old version on this spot as well. Now for those of you who might be new to Yu-Gi-Oh!, being able to activate trap cards from your hand allows you to draw every single card in your deck in one turn, because trap cards are balanced around the fact that you have to wait a turn before activating them, which actually does a really good job of balancing them. So if you remove that balancing limiter, you're able to pull off all kinds of degenerate FTK combos. And I only say this because I have heard of new players wondering why being able to activate trap cards the turn they're set is a good effect. Because if you just added this to a normal deck, that wouldn't be very good. It's decks that have multiple copies of cards like Jar of Greed in them, and the other draw one cards that make it incredibly powerful. And being able to draw every card in your deck in one turn just enables all kinds of OTK strategies, and not just the most obvious one of Exodia. The ability of activating all trap cards from your hand is in itself an effect too broken to be in the game. So if they were to fix this card, they'd have to completely give him a new effect, or change it like Temple of the Kings, where it can only activate one trap card from your hand that turn, instead of all of them. And now, number 1, Exchange of the Spirit. This is another card which got its effect changed because its old effect was too broken. Its old effect was if you had 15 or more cards in your graveyard, you could pay 1,000 life points for both players to swap their decks with their graveyard. So if you just milled 15 cards of your own to the graveyard, and then set this card, you could then activate it during your opponent's turn to instantly mill every card in their deck, since they would have 0 cards in their graveyard. And if anyone ever asked me what is the best deck you could possibly build if you were to use banned cards, the answer used to be Exchange of the Spirit FTK, with Makyura the Destructor or Old School Temple of the Kings, because that is the most consistent FTK deck you could possibly run, since it allows you to draw every single card in your deck pretty easily, and mill all the cards in your opponent's deck, while activating Exchange of the Spirit on your first turn. But ever since they changed the card, that would no longer be the answer. Exchange of the Spirits nowadays has the effect where both players need to have 15 or more cards in their graveyard, and then you could use Exchange Spirits to swap their decks with their graveyards. And if your opponent has to have 15 cards in their graveyard for you to use this effect, you can no longer mill their entire deck with one card. And to add to that, they also gave it a once per duel effect. This new version of Exchange of the Spirit is not even a good card, whereas its old version was completely broken. So, I guess they actually did a good job of fixing it, since now it does what it was probably intended of doing, instead of being a completely degenerate card. Alright, and that's it for the video. Now I know there are a lot of other really broken cards that I didn't include, and that's because I chose the 10 I thought were the most broken. If you think one of the other many cards in the game were more broken than the cards I described on this list, I'd love to know your reasons why. And if you have ideas for videos similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.